what I want to do is sketch out from, you might say, 20,000 feet up, what is going on in the fundamental approach to, you might say, epistemic realism in Aristotle or in Aquinas' reading of Aristotle. And then I want to, I hope, at the end or toward the end, constructively contrast this first with some elements of Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, and then in another way with just a few passages from Nietzsche to advert to ways that from Kant to Nietzsche, we see actually a pivot appealing in some sense to the same starting points as Aquinas, but from an approach of ontological science or study of the metaphysical construction of reality to a study of the constructivist subject manifesting through thought its own conjectures or constructions of reality. Sort of a turn through the Copernican revolution of Kant from the object to the subject, but around some of the same principles. So let me start at a very classic place, and interestingly one that's not always taught in philosophy departments nowadays, but one which remains in more historical programs of fundamental reference, and that's with the claim by Aristotle that Aquinas takes up that there are pre-demonstrative forms of knowledge. That is to say, we cannot prove everything because to prove anything, we must always know something. So we should ask ourselves, what is it we've always already known that makes it possible for us to first begin to then reason towards ideas that we can debate or dispute through dialectic and demonstration. And famously, Aristotle is going in the fourth book of the Metaphysics to look back to the principle of non-contradiction as a foundational starting point for metaphysical realism. Now, the principle of non-contradiction itself is subject to many debates, but what I'm going to go ahead and do is make a fundamental claim that there's a side of it that's ontological in content and a side of it that's semantic and logical in form. And I'm just going to go ahead and read here this starting point, at this starting point, two texts from the Metaphysics Book 4, and I give you the references so you can go and look all this stuff up and study it more intensively. So Aristotle says, evidently then, such a principle is the most certain of all. Which principle is this? We proceed to say it is that the same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject in the same respect. So I take it that here he's really talking about something concerning reality. It is not the case that we can both be, it can be attributed to us here, that we are in a conference in Leuven and that we are in a conference in Paris at the same time under the same aspect. That pertains to the accident of place. So you're saying something about reality. And then he parallels this with the semantic form. Opposite assertions cannot be true at the same time. So it follows from the metaphysical claim I've just made that we ought not to say, I am currently speaking in Paris, I am currently speaking in Leuven. And both these things are true in some respect at the same time or under the same circumstance. Now, you could just start with the latter, and then you could concern yourself only with the coherence of language or with the logical cohesion of language. But I think the logical cohesion and coherence of language for Aristotle here is running parallel to or in complement to a more fundamental noetic apprehension of the nature of reality. We are not in Paris, we are in Leuven. Now, Aquinas commented on this and other ideas in the Commentary on the Metaphysics that he composed, and I'll read you this paragraph from the Marietti edition 603. Therefore, if someone were to think that two contradictories are true at the same time by thinking that the same thing both is and is not at the same time, notice he's emphasizing the thing, the reality itself, he will have contrary opinions at the same time. Right? So that's in the idea of like what he says or what he thinks or what he expresses. And thus contraries will belong to the same thing at the same time in speech. Right? But this is impossible. It is impossible then for anyone to be mistaken in his own mind about these things and to think that the same thing both is and is not at the same time. And it is for this reason that all demonstrations reduce their propositions to this proposition as the ultimate opinion common to all, for this proposition is by nature the starting point and axiom of all axioms. So the claim here, which is famous but also rather amazing and interesting, is that you cannot disprove, nor actually even prove, the claim that we operate intellectually according to the principle of non-contradiction, actually, as soon as you make a semantic claim, you're starting to do it. So I say to you in the grocery store, "Why are you here, David?" And I say, "Mr. Hume, why are you here in the grocery store?" And he says, "Well, I'm here to buy milk." And then he reaches out and he's buying gasoline. I would say, "Well, that's not gasoline. Oh, you're right. I was distracted. Thank you very much. I shouldn't drink the gasoline. I should drink the milk." In the practical order, it is the case that we semantically denote through practical agency that we are acting in view of ends or for certain procedures, through certain procedures for various purposes that entail some kind of logical coherence. So we can ignore the speculative claim while we're operating practically, but when we operate practically, we tend to disavow any contradiction of this claim. That is to say, people in practical real life don't usually ever violate the principle of non-contradiction. They say one thing because they're doing one thing, and they say another thing because they're doing another thing in the practical order. But the correlate to it, the deeper metaphysical level is because we know milk is not gasoline and gasoline is not milk. Now, asking what the difference between gasoline and milk really is, and whether they're artifacts, and whether they're artifacts that have essences, and whether they're different than plants and animals, or for that matter, non-living things, that's itself a metaphysical question. But we're operating antecedently to that, just in claiming that we can know the difference between gas and milk and stars and plants and animals and human beings. And that then becomes an interesting realistic metaphysical question of whether there is a difference or are differences between these kinds of realities. And that brings us to the second principle of fundamental metaphysical realism for Aquinas and Aristotle, although this principle they don't name quite as overtly. This is a modern interpretation of their thought, although I think a defensible one. And that's the principle of identity. Because if you think about it, if I know and I'm saying, well, milk is not gasoline and gasoline is not milk in the grocery store, it presupposes that milk has an identity, again, ontologically in itself. There's a reality there to be known and understood and studied and perhaps regulated by the health laws of the European Union and studied by scientists and so forth. So I say here the positive corollary of the principle of non-contradiction is the principle of identity. If distinct realities really are not identical with one another, that's because each one has a positive identity in itself, an identity that is determined. I have some typos in this handout. That is to say, concrete, real, and intelligible. Aquinas follows Aristotle here in thinking then in terms of the basic categories or categorical modes of being, substance and accidents. And you can talk about the accidents as properties that are inalienable to a certain kind of thing, like to be human is to be a reasonable animal, capable, for example, of humor, or capable of rational behavior, freedom, and so forth. And then there's accidental properties that are not, that don't pertain per se to the essence, like the color of our skin, or how long your hair is, or whether you have a birthmark on your arm, which are things that don't enter into the definition of what it is to be human. Now, this is, of course, one of the most important topics in all the history of metaphysics in the West, which is the ontology of the substance and of its properties. And Aristotle writes about it in his earlier period in the categories, and then he goes back through it in a much more profound way in the metaphysics, and everybody in the Western tradition commented the metaphysics, including Aquinas, to try to get at what are we looking at in you might call it the folds, the declinations, or the dimensions of reality when we denote, say, a substance versus, say, a quality versus, say, a quantity or a relation or time or place. And so these folds or these distinct structures in reality all have a kind of distinct intelligibility. And Aquinas will argue in the Metaphysics commentary, they're all really irreducible to one another in the real thing itself, and they should be then also in our mode of thinking about them. So just to take the substance denotes, on the Thomistic rendering of Aristotle, the individual who has a certain essence or nature. So I've given you a very Roman example, since I'm neighbors with him, and I've invited Simon Peter into the conversation. So you could have an individual who is Simon Peter, and we say he's a rational human being. Now notice the principle of non-contradiction will apply not only to natures, but also to individuals. So if I were to tell you, I had I have come to the belief in my flight from Rome to Belgium that possibly I am Simon Peter. And I was thinking about setting up an alternative ecclesial structure while I'm here in Belgium, and I was wondering if there are any volunteers. Right, we could introduce the principle of contradiction helpfully and say, Leo is not to be confused with TJ, and TJ is not to be confused with Leo. I mean, individually, if I confuse you for, say, your twin brother, then or some other human being who may or may not look like you, or who I mistakenly identify you with, right? We're correcting that based on the ontology of the real. Which individual human being is this? But it's also the case that the nature of the thing obtains. So I could have a question: are all Jewish people human? It has become a question in recent history, but it's a historical. It's a question for other people, other species of people. It's not species. Other, say, ethnic groups of persons, people at different times and states of life, people with different colors of skin. And historically, there's an interesting taxonomy to look at the accidents or properties of human beings that have been employed by other human beings to argue that a human being is not essentially human. Right, so the principle of non-contradiction has actually quite important, identity and non-contradiction can have incredibly powerful moral components when rightly deployed. And they can have disastrous components when wrongly deployed or when they're misunderstood. When you look at then an individual like Simon Peter who has a human nature, you can then denominate properties, such as his quantity. I've made him in empiric measurement 5'10". Well, I don't know, probably shorter. But the truth is, that's not what he is. So like if I say to you, what are you? And you say, I am 6'7" and I play basketball. I am quantity. I say, I understand what you mean metaphorically and poetically, but it's not true metaphysically. You are a rational animal who has an extraordinary height and is an exceptional quality. You have the exceptional quality of being a basketball player. So you can have a quantity that is an important characteristic about what you are, that qualifies what you are. And then you have qualities, like in Peter's case, impetuous, perceptive, and courageous. You can have real relations, such as being the son of, begotten of someone like Jonas, or being related to your brother Andrew. You can have stable habits, like being capable of fishing or speaking a given language. You conduct yourself through certain actions, and you also undergo certain sufferings, called passions, or in Latin, passiones. You live and act in a given time and a given place, and in that given time and place, you respond to your environment through certain stances or ways of being, positioning yourself toward them. Now, in addition to these dimensions of what I'm calling identity, the categorical modes of being pertaining to the individuals of given natures with their properties, i.e. substances and their accidents, in addition to this, there are certain features of all beings that transcend any specific category of being, be it accidental or substantial, and any proper nature, be it like human nature or kangaroo nature or star nature or cactus nature. What I'm talking about are the transcendentals, and these are features of reality that enter into everything. Famously, the most fundamental is being. In Latin, Aquinas will talk about ens, which implies both existence and essence or nature. He'll talk about res, which is another word that means thing, of course, but it's another word probably for essence or natural identity. Unity, he uses the word aliquid to mean a kind of a alterity or a somethingness that makes it a thing distinct from other things related to them. Truth and goodness, and famously there's the question of whether you can attribute beauty to everything that exists. So, just to use an example of goodness, you could talk about a good quantity, like say we're ordering pizza, something very, straightforward. What's a good quantity of pizza for a crowd of 40 people, as opposed to a good quality of pizza, or a good quantity of red wine, a good quality of red wine. And then you could talk about whether a person has a sufficient quantity of height to play basketball, but that's different than talking about if they're a good qualified player. So there's a real distinction on this view between quality and quantity, but notice goodness is attributable to both. And even before you become a good basketball player, or for example, a good moral and ethical person, or a good philosopher through the intellectual virtue of philosophical reasoning, you're still in the crib as a child on this view of things, substantially ontologically good, just in virtue of the nobility of the kind of nature you have. So even the child who's still in potency, let's call him LeBron. LeBron is in potency to become a basketball player, or he's in potency to become a great violinist, or to become a philosopher or a theologian. But even in the crib, baby LeBron is intrinsically ontologically good because he's constituted by the nobility of having a human nature. And this would also be said in another way of the baby wallaby, or the baby kangaroo, or it would be said in another way of the very small rose plant that has begun to grow, or it could be said of a stone, or it could be said of a river, that there's something good about it being. Now that's a very complicated and controversial thing to defend, but I'm willing to try to do it in another iteration. The point is, we've started pulling on a thread from the beginning, saying semantically you can't say this is that and that is this, when it's obviously not the case that they aren't the same thing at the same time under the same aspect. And that has a grounding in reality. The things really are distinct from one another according to their intrinsic identities that distinguish them. What are these intrinsic identities? They're these things denoted by the categorical modes of being of substance and accidents. So we have different kinds of things, like kangaroos and human beings. There are different individuals that are instantiating these kinds of natures and properties. And in all of these things, in everything we experience, there are certain common attributes or transcendental properties like being, unity, goodness, truth, that are found in everything, but according to, you might say, a certain hierarchical range of being, or different modes of being. So we could debate whether the goodness of the kangaroo is the same as the goodness of the human being, or the goodness of the star that's not alive is as good as that of the kangaroo, or if it's the case under certain aspects that one is better than another and the other better than the first. But all of this starts to unfold once we get serious about just saying that what we're saying when we're thinking about reality is based on interior content or identity of the realities themselves as comparable with one another and as internally composed by these kind of composite identities of substance and properties with something common to all of them. So that then brings us to a third area, which I'll probably pass through a little more quickly, which is causality. And then I want to finish with sufficient reason. Once we begin, it seems to me, on Aquinas' view of Aristotle, that once we begin to dig into the ontological content of the real, we find that all the things we're thinking about, talking about, studying, be it human beings or stars or plants or animals, are interdependent on one another, and they also develop internally and historically through in intelligible ways that we can denote by referring to explanation or causality. And causality has to do, in an analogical way, with either the dependence of one thing or on another, or with an internal composite interdependence in a thing itself, or with the dependence of an inclination or orientation of reality. Now, what I'm doing in a kind of sort of indirect way is referring here to the famous four causes. That's, say, efficient causality, formal causality, material causality, and final causality. Now, Aristotle explores these before Book 4 in the Metaphysics, in Book 2, which is debatably an independent writing that the librarians who collated inserted into the text there. Probably, maybe, maybe not. But it stands alone as its own kind of little book, or it can do. In any case, in interpreting Aristotle, Aquinas invites us to think about how, like, the identity of things, when peered into, manifests causality. So just to go back to Simon Peter, one of the things, of course, famously in the New Testament, in Matthew, Jesus Christ says to Simon Peter, "You are Simon, the son of Jonas." So you see how the Aramaic mind, the Aramaic language, and the Semitic mind at the time, you identify a person through whose father you are, who's your father, and whose son you are, right? So Jesus just enters into that, you might say, culturally. But that requires a causal relationship between parents and children that can be denoted. And indeed, very few people would deny that there are such things in reality as parents and children. In fact, it's something so fundamental that it's very rare for there to be books composed by philosophers in which skepticism is cast upon the very question of whether there is parentage. And indeed, it repeats itself in other forms in biology, in either dimorphic male-female complementary forms in mammals, or in other forms in other biological living realities. Right? You have parentage, you have generation of living things, and we are all generated living things. So just to get at what a human being is, we have to be thinking in terms of efficient causality. Where do we come from? We come from being generated as living beings from others. Right? So now we're thinking about how, based on the identity of a thing, human being, human nature, we're looking at causality of where we come from. But we're also looking at what we are in ourselves. And we see that because all the physical realities, and certainly all the living organic realities that we experience, are complex, we can talk about a material cause. We are human in and through immensely complex organic living systems, like our lungs and our respiratory system, our cardiac system, our digestive system. So there's material causality, that of which we're composed, in and through which we act as living beings. And then there's something formal about us, that is to say, we are, this is Aristotle's claim, we are a unified living being. If there really is a unity to the whole, and it's a unity that is asserting itself in and through all the material living parts, living organic dimensions of the person, then you can talk about a unifying formal principle. That's where you get the problem or the question of what the soul is. But it's also going somewhere. We live in view of certain things, like human beings tend to want to be happy, and they tend to want to find out the truth. And it's very rare to find someone who's purposely spending their whole life trying to be unhappy, or who enjoys being lied to and deceived. Because there's an innate appetite for happiness and truth, just as there is for respiration or for digestion. So when we start to then unfold what it means to be categorically, you might say, identitarian, what it is to have a certain kind of identity, it then can be enriched furthermore by looking at causality and causal interdependencies. Because it's not just the case that we depend on those who historically generated us, but right now, you and I depend on the earth being a fairly reasonable temperature to preserve bodily life. So we are definitely dependent on one sun, on the star we call the sun, and we're dependent on certain elements in the atmosphere like oxygen, and we're probably also really just deeply dependent on the whole economy of farming and distribution of food that goes on in our quadrant of the world at any given moment. So there's huge causal interdependencies that are ever actual, that enter into the very intelligibility of things. And then through this, you can get to the final principle, which is, I think, in Aristotle and Plato and Aquinas, but some people think only originates with Leibniz. And there's a form of it in Leibniz, I think, that is not in those people, but there is a form of it in those people that's different than what you find in Leibniz. And that's the principle of sufficient reason. And the way I take it, that's simply to say that when a thing is caused by another thing, there is some proportionality between the cause and the effect that characterizes the very intelligibility of reality. So, for example, I mean, we do that. This is the bread and butter of medical science, right? So you go into the emergency room because you have an extreme pain in your lower right quadrant, and the nurse asks you, as she's preparing you to talk to the doctor, have you ever had your appendix out? And you say, no, ma'am, I have not. Or no, sir, I have not. And they press a little bit and you scream. And they say, that is in the region of the appendix. Okay, they're looking for the sufficient reason for why you're in pain and what is the organic failure that is the source of the distress that you're experiencing in your body. And so then they conduct tests. And you're very glad they're conducting the tests because you want to figure out what's causing this and how to get it out of you, right? And then they might incise by an emergency operation the side of the body cavity, go in and find it has not yet ruptured, and remove your inflamed appendix, which is sending your white blood cell content up really high. And then once they remove it and suture you up and give you antibiotics, you experience no more symptoms. Now that's a very, very common story. And the doctor doesn't have to have a degree in metaphysics. He just needs to be really good in biology and surgical medicine and experience. But he is being metaphysical insofar as he or she is trying to find the cause that's a sufficient reason for the pain. So if you went in with that same ailment and he said, no problem, I got you covered, we're almost certainly experiencing here a deep cardiac problem, which is causing the lower right quadrant. We're going to do a full heart transplant. We're going to have to try to apply right now to find someone who can substitute their heart organ for yours. I'm going to start up a 12-hour operation. I'm calling in 5 other physicians. We're going to remove your heart, and we're going to put in a new one, and that little pain on your right lower quadrant is going to go away. You'd say, I want a second opinion, right? Because that doesn't seem like the sufficient reason. Okay, so that's a kind of bread and butter example, but we're doing this all the time. Like, the professor gets a suspicious paper because it looks like an AI made up these very silly answers to everything in the exam. It doesn't look like, in terms of the principle of sufficient causality, this was created by human intelligence. This was created by some kind of formatted artificial intelligence. Or on a more fundamental level, when we start to talk about where existence comes from, where do we originate from? Aquinas will use the argument, for example, in Summa Theologiae, Prima Pars, question 3, article 4, right? The famous place on divine simplicity. He talks about the real distinction between essence and existence. And he says, because our nature is not such that it can bring itself into existence, nor can it sustain itself in existence, we have to say that we are not the authors of our own existence, nor is anything else that we experience. But that means there's a problem about what causes existence. And can you have everything simply downstream in being, that's to say receiving its existence from another, or is there something that is not composed of essence and existence, not receiving its being or its existence from others or another, and that is itself the source of existence for all others? And he says, we need to find the sufficient reason for why things exist, and we can't satisfy ourselves with that until we reach the creator who's giving existence to all things. And this that we call God is something that is someone or something that exists by nature, in which there does not obtain the same distinction of essence and existence that obtains in us. So you see Aquinas appealing there in a really vaulted, vertical way to the principle of causality of existence, and then the question of the sufficient reason for existence to go all the way up into God. Okay, I'm going to pivot now to another figure not less important in the history of thought than Aquinas, and that's Immanuel Kant. A figure about whom I know very much less and am much less well instructed. But what I want to do with Kant is just show how, to a certain extent, it's not from Aquinas himself, nor is it from Suarez, who would have been a remote cause, a more proximate historical cause of Kant's thinking, but more through people like Bloom-Garden and Leibniz, that Kant is trying to grapple with, actually, in some cases, the same principles. But what he's doing is instead of thinking about these principles that I've appealed to as ventures in the study of reality and the structures of reality, under the influence of Hume's skepticism and in his own creative and unique original appropriation of Hume's skepticism, Kant, in his proper form of skepticism, is going to, you might say, deny the immediate relationship between the intellect and the structures of reality, or the access to what he will call the noumenon, the things in themselves, and instead say that through sensate intuitions, through sense experiences, what's going on instead is we're employing these principles, yes, but we're employing them more to construct an analytic approach to reality, a way of thinking about reality that allows us to navigate our way around the world for practical purposes. And one of the things I just want to say before I say just a few summary words about Kant is it's super important, I think. I may be wrong about this reading of him, but I think it's super important that for Kant, nature as he's describing it, this whole process of constructivist reasoning, is timeless and identical in all human beings. Kant is merely the first person to fully have discovered it, but it's been going on and it will be going on in us perpetually. And this is very important because what's going to happen after him is that perspective about how all of us always construct reality subjectively is going to be placed, you might say, on historical wheels by 19th century German idealists of various stripes, and then radicalized in Nietzsche in reaction to all of them, to where it's going to be understood in a much more historical and, you might say, culturally fluid way, so that you're subjectively constructing reality using principles, not always everywhere in the same way as a subjectivist, but now in, you might say, a myriad of thousands of subjectivities through hundreds of different cultures, in millions of different individual subjectivities. And so there's this, I say, temporal liberation that goes on from the constraints of Kantian normativity toward the freedom of Nietzschean individual artistic construction of meaning, or artistic construction of sense. So, I mean, famously, Immanuel Kant says in the preface of the Critique of Pure Reason that he's undertaking a Copernican revolution. So this is like, does the earth go around the sun, or does the sun go around the earth, or does the earth go around the sun? So having made the mistake of thinking the sun is going around the earth, you know, we can be subject to a revolution in thinking, turning our thinking to understand that we on the earth are going around the sun. So what we thought was relative to us, actually we're relative to it. But it's actually, in a way, the opposite of that in terms of the Copernican revolution being operated here. So what he's going to say is, these gentlemen in the Middle Ages and in the early rationalists like Leibniz, they think that we're using these principles to talk about how we know the reality in itself. But if we undertake the revolution of thinking that's necessary, we'll see actually these principles are emanating from us, from the transcendental subject, from the thought world of the human subject in his or her reasoning, so as to give a kind of order to our basic human experience, to thematize it, to categorize it, to try to give a sort of meaning to it that's primarily subjective. And it's stable, because we must act this way, and all of us do it in the same way, more or less. And we can even get very important ethical ideas out of this about how we ought to live with one another according to the categorical imperative. But what we cannot say is that this gives us immediate purchase on the realities in themselves, in the ways that people like Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas had thought. So if you look at this little passage I've given you from early on in the Critique, he says, objects are given to us by means of sensibility, and it alone yields us intuitions. Now, I mean, in the classic language, intuition can mean 1,000 things, but one way classically to read it in like Aristotle and Aristotle's acts of nous, these are intuitions that are not merely sensate, they're intellectual, intellectus in Latin, nous in Greek. It's intuitive knowledge of the ontological content of reality intellectually perceived. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the principle of non-contradiction in its ontological content, or the principle of identity. And it would seem from some of these things that Kant is saying, he's sort of prohibiting that from the beginning. Instead, what you're getting is sensate intuition, and you're going to then construe out of that a kind of meaning subjectively of how to make sense of the objects of sense perception. They are thought through the understanding, and from the understanding arises concepts. But all thought must directly or indirectly, by way of certain characters, relate ultimately to intuitions, and therefore with us to sensibility, because in no other way can an object be given to us. I mean, there's a whole way to interpret this by suggesting how he's being affected by David Hume and what impact Hume's having on him. But presuming that there is a connection, which I'm doing here, this kind of skeptical moment is now being introduced, where you don't have the leisure to presuppose that your concepts must correlate back to substances with properties or transcendental characteristics of reality. So then just an example of sort of where this can go is found when he discusses substance. And I've given you a passage where he's talking about the classic doctrine of substance. And he says, I find that at all times, not merely the philosopher, but even the common understanding has presupposed this persistence as a substratum of all change in the appearances. He means, like, if I say, okay, I have baby pictures of you when you were 1 year old, and then I see a picture of you when you're 14, and I see a picture of you now, and you'll get older, you're always the same being. There's some substantial identity that persists through time. And he says, and so he's questioning whether we can really say things like that. And he says, it's been accepted as indubitable. Only the philosopher expresses himself somewhat more determinately in saying that in all alterations in the world, the substance remains and only the accidents change. But I nowhere find even the attempt at a proof of this so obviously synthetic proposition. Indeed, it only rarely stands, as it deserves to, at the head of the purely and completely a priori laws of nature. What he's saying, I believe, is we have sensate experiences of, say, our brothers and sisters when they're 2 years old or 12 years old or 14 years old, or our parents enduring through time, or ourselves enduring through time. And we construct an a priori notion of substance as a kind of ticket that we put on that to speak about the memory we have of multiple sensations and the perceptions that go with those sensations, the intellectual reflections, so that we can denote, you might say, the hypothesis of sustained identity, or a kind of referential way of referring to prolonged experiences of the phenomena that endure. This is very different than saying that we know that there is a substantial identity in the reality itself, based on a unity of being in the thing itself. In fact, the proposition that substance persists is tautological. Now, interestingly, he's saying quite the same thing as Aristotle, and says it's pre-demonstrative. But in him, in this case, that's becoming a problem, because he wants to say, you can't just intuit it. It cannot be presupposed or known a priori from the things themselves. It is a construction of reason necessary. Everyone uses it. It's not bad, but it's primarily from the subject as a way of organizing our sensate experience. Once you presuppose that it corresponds to the very structure of reality in itself, now you're moving into something you should have demonstrated. And since you haven't, and you're simply affirming it, you're operating it according to you're doing something we'll use a bad word for, which is a tautology. You're performing a tautological operation. So, I mean, this is a really interesting experience. Example, he does this with things like causality as well, and then says that what we call causality is a way of talking about the experiences of antecedent and consequent experience. Something happens and another thing happens. I see someone move their hand this way to draw the bow of the violin or the cello across the cello strings, and then I hear music emitted, and I have readily constructed the notion of causality to talk about that antecedent and consequent relationship. And I must do so, and everyone will do so. And Newtonian physics won't work unless we do so. That being said, the standpoint here is that this is primarily in the noetic order as a way of construing and organizing knowledge of reality. Now, most interestingly, very famously, at the end of the critique, he brings up the topic of God. And he says a number of things that are very important. One of them is that the notion of causality that we use, because it's located in the field of sensate experiences to apply to antecedent and consequent events, cannot be used intelligibly for non-sensible affairs. So we cannot take the notion of causality and then by analogy ascribe it to things that are not sensate in nature. And this is one of the reasons, among others, that the arguments for the existence of God for Kant don't have a very powerful viability, or they're not very compelling. He is interested, however, in the famous ontological argument, you might say the idea of the perfect being, that comes famously from Anselm in one regard and from Descartes in another. And he does want to save something from that, because he does want to say, once you start to construct a knowledge of reality or a way of organizing sense experience in light of causality, so you can put tickets on things, calling them substances, talking about causality, thinking about interdependencies that you experience through antecedent consequent actions that regularly repeat, that allows us to then construct scientific knowledge of the universe. You do need to think about the whole of the universe, and you need to think about something like a total cognitive content, a kind of coherentist account of all truth in light of the unity of all truth. But to think about that is to think about God as the source of all truth, or the source of all reality. So we can never prove or disprove that God exists, but we must think of the world as if God is the source of global intelligibility. We construct or postulate the idea of God so as to suggest that there's a holistic order that's always more available to us through sensate experience of the world. And so the idea of God is a kind of inevitability for speculative reason. It remains also only ever a hypothesis, never verifiable or disprovable. Now, I'm not going to worry much about that aspect. I think this is very important. This is a very important issue about whether Immanuel Kant's, first of all, I may not have got him right, and there's a lot more one can say, but whether after Immanuel Kant there's a kind of necessary prohibition on metaphysical thinking in general and metaphysical thinking about God in particular. And you can imagine I'm not convinced of that. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't be dressed the way I am. But what I am interested in here is just turning to Nietzsche very briefly at the end, because I think there's a way in which Nietzsche is closer to Aquinas and further than Kant in one regard, and closer to Kant and further than Aquinas in another regard. Now, I think he's closer to Kant in that he thinks that the metaphysical categories of the West functioned and still function as a kind of unquestioned metagrammar. By metagrammar, I mean a most fundamental form of discourse by which we speak to one another as if the world is intelligible and dictate the normative forms of intelligibility that we conventionally agree on as a civilization. So there's this unquestioned metagrammar. I'm about to read a very interesting passage about that. And this metagrammar is a kind of orientation for us towards reality. Like Kant, then, I think Nietzsche thinks that this is a primarily subjectively constructed vehicle for organizing experiences. But unlike Kant, and very importantly, he thinks because it has no ontological purchase on reality, it's a kind of a fiction, and even a counterproductive fiction. It's an illusion that's keeping us from really getting back to the question of what truth is, how to avoid nihilism, how to find meaning in life, how to celebrate existence, and how to transcend the constraints, what he considers the constraints of the metaphysical grammar of ancient Hellenism and of Judeo-Christian tradition. So he's a lot more radical than Kant on chasing up the you might say, the consequences of Kant's subjectivism. But he's closer to Aquinas in another regard, because, I mean, for Aquinas, this knowledge is, in some ways, of course, Nietzsche and Aquinas are at antipodes in regard to this idea that the mind actually does, you might say, receive reality in its structures that are pre-existing the mind's study. For Aquinas, you're finding out about, you might say, God's world, or about the world in its inner intelligibility, its metaphysical density, and to see that was there antecedent to your own search to construe meaning. You find meaning through finding the very meaning of life in the things themselves. But this form of knowledge is so fundamental for Aquinas and is ontological in character, such that if Kant is right that we can't really get back to a fundamental noetic engagement with reality of the kind Aristotle had envisaged, then Nietzsche's position seems like the more pure position. That is to say, we're either condemned to or liberated for a much more radical form of constructivist subjectivism. So there's a way in which, maybe on my reading at least, Aquinas and Nietzsche represent pure positions, and Kant's position is somewhere in the middle, which is something Nietzsche accuses him of. He says it's like a poor man's Plato, because you try to keep the essentialism without reference to the things in themselves. And Aquinas might think that from the other side, like it's a poor man's Nietzsche, where you've got the constructivism, but you haven't severed with the heritage of metaphysical thinking with sufficient radicality, given your premises. I mean, it's a suggestion. But anyway, let me just read a couple of paragraphs. This is my suggested way of interpreting. Just to finish then, let me read a couple of things. These are from the writings of the late notebooks of Nietzsche, which Cambridge organized and got new translations of. His sister produced The Will to Power, is the book that she produced that was from his late notebooks, but it wasn't, she didn't do it, she ordered it according to her own whims or interests. What has happened in recent decades is we've gone back and found like what he was writing, in his later period that went into that book. Anyway, he says here, the last thing in metaphysics we'll rid ourselves of is the oldest stock, assuming we can rid ourselves of it, that stock which has embodied itself in language and the grammatical categories and made itself so indispensable that it almost seems that we could cease being able to think if we relinquished it. Now, he's clearly talking about something like the principle of non-contradiction and the categorical modes of being, but he's talking about it more largely, like the reception of that tradition throughout Western philosophical history, this idea of a kind of metagrammar of the real. Philosophers in particular have the greatest difficulty in freeing themselves from the belief that the basic concepts and categories of reason belong without further ado to the realm of metaphysical certainties. From ancient times they have believed in reason as a piece of the metaphysical world itself. This oldest belief breaks out in them again and again like an overpowering recoil. This is really interesting. It sounds like Aquinas, if you put the Thomistic engine in reverse, because one thing Aquinas will tell you is not only is reason capable of studying these natures and their properties and these categorical modes of being, the mind itself, intellect is itself a nature. There's a nature to the intellect. It works through certain facets like apprehension and composite judgments and syllogistic reasonings, and it makes demonstrations and it tries to prove things or it hypothesizes things. So there's a nature to the intellect. It's made for the truth. It can contemplate. It has different kinds of more and less noble functions. It can divide into practical and speculative reason. So there's a kind of real, like, ontological dimension to what intellect is. And he will, of course, then think about it analogically, angelic intellect and divine intellect. And Nietzsche is sort of saying in the inverted way, like, a lot of times philosophers want to be skeptical about natures, but they still think the intellect has this natural nobility, that it's always going to have these definitive functions by which it structures human existence and its nobility towards the real. And if you think about it, it's a way of thinking about Kant, Kant is much more skeptical about classical metaphysics ad extra, but the life of the mind, the transcendental subject and all the work that he's doing about this timeless way of organizing experience, this ethics that can appeal to all cultures and times and places after the Enlightenment. This is a noble analysis of the nature of intellect. And Nietzsche's kind of saying, well, you're going to have to give up the nature of intellect too, because it's part of the metaphysical grammar of the West that we have to question. And then just one more passage. The inventive force that thought up categories was working the service of needs, of security, of quick comprehensibility using signs and sounds, of means of abbreviation, subject, substance, subject, object, being, becoming, are not metaphysical truths. It is the powerful who made the names of things law, And among the powerful, it is the greatest artists of abstraction who created the categories. So this is this whole idea of kind of knowledge as a socially, as the social construction of a certain kind of caste. And famously, Nietzsche thinks a lot of our Western morality comes from the biblical Hebraic narrative of the predilection for the poor, or the predilection for the weak, and the sort of inversion of values that came about through Judeo-Christianity. And that's in the genealogy of morals. But he also thinks there's a kind of more Hellenistic genealogy of thinking about truth, which remains in many ways at work in modern sciences, where there's the pretension to explain everything by a kind of ultimate register of, an explanation in light of ultimate causes. And now, Nietzsche's not just, it's a mistake to see him as a radical skeptic. He is, in some sense, radically skeptical of so much of the heritage of the European philosophical and religious tradition, but he also has a very important constructive project, and it can be characterized in different ways. There are different interpretations of it. I favor an interpretation that Heidegger makes in some of his middle work about Nietzsche as thinking about the purity of the mind in terms of art. Art. The artist is the person who has the freedom to creatively and prophetically create, kind of iconoclastically against what people thought before, but in view of new visions. And Nietzsche definitely has a profound love of the operatic, a profound love of the poetic, and of the creative artistic dimension of human reason. And I think he's trying to liberate that. And he wants to, in one way, unveil how people like Kant are great artists. They're fooling us through this mirage of beautiful artifacts of the mind into thinking that there's this stability of thought about reality. Actually, we should accept more fluidity and allow that there's this, you might say, more individual and historical freedom to not be bound by these servitudes to these norms around us of metaphysical kinds or of religious kinds, but rather we invest the world with the meaning that we, in a way, narrate poetically, artistically. And there's a kind of love of beauty in Nietzsche that's about the primacy of the artistic. And I think there's huge problems with it, but I think it's a kind of revolution in favor of a certain kind of non-moralistic, non-metaphysics primacy of the aesthetic. But there's other ways to characterize Nietzsche. My point here is simply that there is something potentially unstable in Kant. There's a way of reading Kant in light of Aquinas. There's a way of reading Nietzsche and Kant in light of Aquinas that can make a lot of sense of them. And there's a frontal challenge to Aquinas' views that's offered in one way by Kant, another by Nietzsche, that is really, in a way, still at the heart of the modern university. And it's really the question of noetic purchase on reality, and whether claiming to have noetic purchase on reality is already an articulation of a will to power. That's your truth. You're trying to impose that on me. That comes from your culture. That comes from your genealogical narratives, etc. Or whether there are actually ontological and moral truths we can come to an agreement about, that we can reason toward or in light of, and which can, in fact, create human community, society, and consensus in the truth, as well as ongoing research into the truth. Thank you very much.